Welcome to Between Authors. I am your host, author Adrian Lopez. If you enjoyed this episode today, don't forget to leave a like and a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications so you don't miss all the amazing authors coming up. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that author or book that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt for a reader. The goal from my podcast is to bring you those authors or books that you may never have heard of that may have been the treasure you've been searching for all along. Today in episode 15, I have author John Simmons. We're going to go over a little bit about himself, what he's published, what he's working on, and maybe what his plans are for the future. Welcome to the show, John.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't you give a little introduction to yourself to the viewers?
Okay. So I love science fiction and fantasy, but I've read widely. I have a degree in English Lit. I like languages and cultures. I've traveled, I've taught, and then I've done the really, really nerdiest things possible. I owned a comic book and game store for a long time. And I'm also the founder of a large comic convention. It's the one in Houston called Comicpalooza. And I sold that in 2018. And then I got back into writing. And then I wrote the book that I just published, Explorers of Rinth.
Sounds good. We'll get a little bit more into the comic festival that you were doing before. Why don't you give the viewers a little idea of your influences? And it could be authors, books, art, music, movies, anything that influences your creativity.
Sure. Well, specifically for Explorers of Rinth, I have to give props to Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke and Journey to the Center of the Earth and Flash Gordon. I think those are all the Flash Gordon for kind of the feel and the theme that I don't know if my readers will feel it, but when I was writing it, what I was trying to do kind of reminded me a lot of the old Flash Gordon series.
Mm-hmm.
But I think from a standpoint of the place that was it was inspired a lot by Arthur C. Clarke. So trying to think, is there something else there? There's kind of a cool origin story that I like to tell about that. Originally, it was a short story, and it was a very strange short story about an asteroid that was being sent like a Trojan horse to fight an alien race far, far away.
Mm-hmm.
But it took so long; it was going to be like a generation, and by the time they got there, they'd had kids, and these kids had grown up in a very normal, average, small town kind of way, right? And the short story was about how the kids didn't want to continue this fight and all die. They wanted to live a normal life. And the main character in it, I wanted him to be something relatable and familiar to everyone. And so he was like a jock in this high school. But he bored me so much, I had to come up with something to make him more interesting, right? So I gave him a girlfriend, and that didn't help him. He was still boring. So I wrote him out, and I wrote about her, and then I gave her friends, and that's where my main cast of characters came from. And they were much more interesting. And then I realized it wasn't a short story; it was a novel. And then I had another project that I worked on it was a film project, and it got canceled. And I realized after thinking about it, I was kind of mourning the loss of this project I was looking forward to I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that I could combine these two. And so I did. And that is why Explorers of Rinth has such a very weird narrative construction. It's like reading two books. So
Yeah.
anyway, those are some of the things that went into creating it.
It's interesting. There's so many authors that have told me stories about how you let the story kind of just grow on its own.
Yeah.
Like you said, you started from a short story, completely different character, and there's always the incidents too, as well, for authors where a side character kind of pops its way in, and before you know it, they take it over, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
it just kind of goes back to kind of let the story flow. Don't get yourself so stuck in that, maybe that original outline you wrote, like this is what I want my story to be, because there's so many chances, or so many times where it goes on its own, and that's so much fun on the journey, just to let the story go and you just kind of go with it, where it's almost like you're getting dictated to, rather than
Yeah.
you writing the story. You're just
That's
kind of rolling with it and just going, and that's always some of the best stuff comes out that way.
That's exactly right. And in fact, I have a character. I introduced her, and I didn't even give her a name. And by the end of the book, one of the most important plot changes, twists, whatever you want to call it, hinges entirely on her. Right? Like she became a fulcrum point for the entire story. And yeah, she didn't have a name at first, but there was one other thing when you're talking about influences. There's one other one that I have to mention, and that's D&D. I don't know if you played D&D, but
I never got really fully into it, but I tried it a couple of times. I do understand and know the whole thing.
when so I used to be a short story writer, and it's about plot. I used to write a lot about plot, and when I had a store, I did demo games for my customers, and so I would have them. Um, oh, hold on just a second. That's my wife. That's just I knew it'd be either the dogs or my wife. Okay. So anyway, when I had the store, um, I did demo games for my customers, and so I never knew who was going to show up, right? And I never knew if they were going to continue a plot or change it or whatever. And so I didn't plan everything out like you normally do for those games. And so what I learned to do was I would make up characters as I needed them, and I had to learn to give them personality and plots on the fly. And I'd end up with these characters, and I'd have to introduce them and change things as they went. And they all had to have a purpose for being there, a reason, something they wanted to do, and a name and a voice, and they had to be distinctive.
Yeah.
And so I learned to handle like, a dozen different subplots all at the same time. Everyone had their own thing. And I just did that every single week for years. And so when I came back to writing, I wasn't a short story writer anymore. I was a novelist. And
Yeah.
so that was a huge influence on my style and emphasis while writing. So
And you probably had some of the best training ever doing that, because it's almost like a writing prompt that you're just doing over and over and over again,
yeah.
and just honing your
Yeah.
skills over and over.
And I had no idea that it was changing the way I was going to write.
Yeah.
So
Very interesting. That's a great story. So let's talk about the book, Explorers of Rent. Why don't you give us, or give the viewers, a little bit of a summary or rundown about what the story is about?
well, they got a little bit
Yeah.
when I told about the asteroid. So this asteroid, this takes place 300 years in the future, and this asteroid is one that's out past Saturn. It's a trans-Saturn asteroid, and it's a large one, right? So it's about 24-25 kilometers long. I'm using metric. I figure eventually, the metric system will win. But it's a pretty long asteroid, and the history of it is that at some point, this company, an exocorp, I set up exocorps as companies that operate entirely in space and not on Earth, and therefore they do not have a government that they answer to, right? No taxation, right? I figure as soon as a company can do it, they'll do it.
Yeah.
Um, And they went way out to basically terraform the inside of this asteroid. They tunneled it out, and they put facilities in it. They spun it so it would have artificial gravity. And they did that because way out there, they could experiment and research on anything they wanted, whether it was illegal, unethical, or whatever, right? They could do whatever they liked.
Yep.
And eventually this company, it fell apart or went bankrupt, and they abandoned it. And it was left for a long period of time where just the things they'd been experimenting on were there. And then the humans come back to it. But it's a huge facility, like going from the center, or going from like the rim, the outside rim where most of the construction is, to the center would be like climbing Mount Everest. So it's like a giant city in a burrito. And so what it means is there's lots of things that are hidden in this place, and they're crazy things because they experimented on all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of, so instead of being a story that follows the Wellesian principle, the idea that you have one thing that transforms society, which is how H.G. Wells wrote, there was always just one thing in his books.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking forward to a future when there are many things that are transformative, much like our time now. And so there are a lot of different things in this, and many of them have not been discovered by the people who've been living there for the past couple decades. So it has a very strong theme of exploration, but it has themes of it explores things like AI and genetic engineering, and there's a lot of talk about ethics, because lots of things that were done there or may still be done are completely unethical. And so one of the things I hope is that I give the reader lots of, I let them see that there are lots of difficult choices. There's no simple,
yeah,
this is right and that's wrong. I mean, you got to weigh a lot of things. But so it's a very strange and diverse space, even though it's compacted into a very tiny area.
It sounds like it'd be very similar to like building a community center above Arkham Asylum or something. You just have all the weird stuff going on inside, and it's this poor little community on top.
Kind of, but again, going back to the whole Flash Gordon thing, where you had the one world with the many different races,
Yeah.
right? That was sort of the feel that I had while I was writing it. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and it turns out there's politics in it, and different takes on religion, and a lot of questioning, a lot of learning how to deal with things that maybe we wouldn't be comfortable calling people.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions I generally ask. Was there a favorite scene in the book? And it could be the scene itself, or it could be, your experience writing the scene.
So that's really hard because there are a lot of scenes that I really liked. But when I go through the book, I change point of view characters a lot. There's a lot of point of view characters. And one of my favorites, which surprised me, right? Like I'm writing them and all like, oh, wow, this is great. I was having fun. It was one of the primary antagonists. And I actually have a couple because I'd taken two different stories and put them together. So I actually have two different antagonists. But the main antagonist was a lot of fun to write. And she was easy to write. And she's horrible. But at the same time, like when I read the chapter, she's only got 1 point of view chapter, but when I read that chapter to my critique group, they all fell in love with her. Like, oh wow, I love this character, and she's the big boogeyman.
Yeah.
And so that was one of my favorite ones. largely because it was unexpected. I didn't think I was going to like her that much, but she was a lot of fun to write.
Yep. This is not a normal question I ask, but because of that character, because how much you did enjoy it, and because the limited time you gave her point of view style, do you ever find yourself thinking about possibly maybe giving her a spin-off, her own book, or something more backstory of who she is?
Uh I don't think so. Like, I think some, it's like when you're cooking, I love rosemary, but I'm not going to dump a cup of rosemary in anything. Um, she's really good in small doses.
Okay.
And I think she would be horrifying and just wear the reader out and she would wear me out if I had to write from her point of view all the time, because it's a very high energy character. And I mean, like, some characters, it's relaxing, you read through, she's on you all the time. And so she's a lot of fun, but I wouldn't switch to her point of view very often.
You definitely sold that character. I mean, that does sound like an amazing character and chapter.
I hope I didn't, put too much hype into it, but I mean, that was the way I saw it. She was fun. If it's any consolation, they liked the other main antagonist too, although he's sort of incompetent, but very powerful. But what I did when I was writing, when I switched point of view, is I wrote from whichever point of view, whichever character had the best vantage point of whatever the changing plot was at the time. And so some of them, like particularly the main characters, have a lot of point of view chapters. But then there are a lot of characters that are small characters that have a chapter also. And to me, it fleshed the world out a lot. You see a lot of things from a lot of points of view.
It's interesting because point of view switches are sometimes very difficult to write, to be able to do it and flow smoothly. Do you think that goes back to the D&D days where you're having to come up with stuff on the fly, and that kind of, again,
Absolutely.
a training ground for you?
Absolutely. For me, it is nothing to be like, I used to do this when I was running the game. I'd be like, the characters would be standing around trying to decide what to do, and I'd have one of the NPCs say something, and then one of the other ones says something. The next thing I know, I've got all of them talking, and nobody else is talking. Now, they loved it, right? They loved it, but it is nothing for me to run 6 or 8 characters all together at the same time, and so I mean, that is a skill that I got from doing a lot of role playing.
Yeah.
In that kind of unusual role playing format where it wasn't just a couple of buddies, right? And yeah, I think the point of view switching, to me, it would be much more challenging to stick in one point of view all the time. I have a hard time imagining constraining the story to that,
Yep. Yeah, that's interesting. On the opposite end, then, did you have a hard scene to write, or maybe something as you're trying to write it that you struggled with?
Yeah, I did. Kind of toward the end, I had a point where there was a plot development, right? And I needed 2 different things happening at the same time. Split the group. And one I had no problem with, and the other one I couldn't think of what to write. And it was a great moment in a way, because it made me reflect on how I was writing these stories. And I realized that everything that I wrote, there was some kind of emotional hook. I mean, maybe the reader doesn't feel it the way I do, but there was something for me that I could feel in that character that pulled them through the scene. Maybe it was a change, maybe it was a revelation, maybe it was just their attitude, something they wanted, but there had to be something that was either emotional or intellectual that contributed to it, right? And one of those 2 scenes that I needed to do just had action. Like I could write it and be all action, but it was just so boring to me, right? Like just writing action. I love action, and there's definitely some action scenes, but without either some intellectual hook or emotional hook, the action is just, a car chase on TV. It's nothing. And so I didn't write it. I didn't write it. I skipped it. Right. I did it off screen, like they do in plays where you have the battle happen off scene. Right. I'm like, I dodged it. And then my editor, because I decided I was going to have an editor, my developmental editor said, "What happened during that chapter?" And I'm like, "Can you show it?" I'm like, if she's going to say that, so is everyone else. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I went back and, I had to spend a lot of time, and I spent like writing that chapter took 3 months. Writing the whole book took 8 months. Right? Editing took a long, long time.
Yep.
Writing that chapter after 8 months to write everything else, then I come back to write that chapter, and it was 3 months before I could finish it. But I had to find some kind of emotional center to it. And I really struggled with that for a long time. So it's a long chapter. So if you read a long chapter in there and you're like, damn it, why did you put this long chapter in there? You can blame my editor,
That kind of gives me another question that I'm kind of curious about, because again, it's not the norm to have so many point of view switches. Did your editor have problems with that? Did she have a problem going from the point of view switches when she was editing, or was she smooth with it as well?
No, she didn't have a problem with it. The only thing that she mentioned a couple of times that is like a thing of mine is a lot of times I'll start with something and then flashback, and she likes, like a particular chapter to be more straightforward.
Yeah.
I mean, not as much flashbacky, but I like to start with what I think is I like to often start with what I think is the real point of the chapter, and it may require a flashback. But, generally, when any place where she had a problem with that, I was able to go back and smooth it out, make it a little bit easier, So that wasn't that was just a little bit of work, a little bit of elbow grease, but not a real problem. But the point of view switches, no one who's read it has had a problem with that. And my critique group, they liked seeing things from a lot of different character points of view because it made it fresh and interesting. It's a big book, and I don't think you could. I mean, it would be just kind of ponderous to read the same character all the time. This is more like lots and lots of short stories that all add together into a big narrative.
And it just probably goes to the fact that how well written you did the point of view switches, that nobody did have a problem with the switches or didn't even notice it. So
I hope so. I hope that's.
Sounds like you just did a great job with it. So that's very impressive on that side. So I know you're mentioning that there's kind of two books or two story kind of ideas that were put together for this novel. Besides your training ground on D&D to get you in that groove to do that, was there any research you did specifically for either story or for both?
So one thing I've realized about the writing community is that you can write almost any sort of book and you'll go down research rabbit holes.
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist, but I like science, and I read about it a lot. I read articles on science, something, not technical ones, but for layperson, practically every day. And a lot of that goes into the planning of the world, right? So it'd be hard to say that I did research, that I did a lot of research specifically for it. There are some things that I did, but there's a lot of stuff that I've just read about over the years, and I'm extrapolating things out. But I do look up things like there's a lot of genetics in it. I have a lot of genetic things, and I spent a lot of time thinking about ramifications of, we think about, what about the morality of genetically engineering humans, right? That's a big thing right now. 100 years from now, it's probably not going to be an issue that we think of as a moral issue, but there are different ways we could split on it.
Yep.
And a lot of it I thought about was like, if we tried to, genetically engineer humans and make the human race better, what would that look like? And so I started reading about that. So, for example, if you have somebody who's intelligent, like a genius, or as Wile E. Coyote would say, a super genius, right?
Yep.
After about 3 generations, it tends back to the mean, right? So it's like an anomaly. It's not really like a thing. It's not like when you're breeding dogs and they get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. We don't have that thing where we could breed intelligent people and get them more intelligent. We think, probably it can work because it kind of happened. We came from chimps that were not too smart, but we don't really see that. That would be difficult, right? Yeah. And so I started thinking about, maybe we could raise intelligence a little bit without it trending back to the mean, but maybe the way people as a species look superhuman is there are just fewer people who are below the average. And that would raise the average intelligence as well. But there's a lot of other things. Like, I think the very first thing that we should engineer about ourselves is a simple little gene. I can't remember the name of it, but mammals are one of the few animals in the world that has lost this gene that produces a sun blocking agent. Mammals are much more vulnerable to the sun than, a lizard, for example. And that's because mammals were nocturnal. And we're never going to get that back unless we engineer it, right? And so, like, that would be a natural thing. That would cut skin cancer. It would mean that you wouldn't need as much sunblock when you go outside. Yep. There are lots of great things about it, and we know from nature that it would not be harmful to us, right? Because everything else has it. Shrimp and fish and bird. I'm not sure. I think birds have it. Yeah, birds have it. So, that would be like a first step. And then we think about longevity and, things like our ability to regenerate on our own. All of these different things, but I think it would start with things that we wouldn't expect, like adding that gene back to the human race. And so I thought I did a lot of research on, like limitations. The average human can only think of 3 things at one time. Like, that's all we can manage, right? If you could think of 5 things at one time, you would be like a superhuman. And there's little changes that could all add up. And so I thought a lot about stuff like that. It's more subtle, but I tried to think of what would the natural progression be of these sorts of advances in society, and how would they change in the technology, and how would they change our society? So there's a lot of stuff like that, and it's a lot of detail work.
Mm-hmm.
So,
did publishing this book change your writing process at all? I know you went from short stories to, like you said, a novel, but did it change any way else, the way you approached it or the way you looked at it?
Publishing didn't. So, like, my book is a sci-fi story, and it was written with, like, I've got 2 sets of protagonists. As I told you, it's like 2 stories put together. And one of them is teenagers. So you're going to peg it as a YA book, right? But it wasn't written with that in mind. It was just written with teenage protagonists. But that's where people will put it. But it's a huge book, and it's one where you wouldn't expect it to be there. So I'm like kind of not fitting into genres very well, And if I were really trying to write to the market or write to publishing standards, I couldn't do that. I could spend 50 years trying to publish this book and nobody would nobody would pick it up because it doesn't fit publishing
Yep.
standard.
Hmm.
So, I self-publish, and I'm thinking it's a book where the people who like it won't be able to find anything like it anywhere else because it's so unusual. And so I guess maybe the biggest change is not that publishing is changing my approach to writing, but my approach to writing forces me to take on the publishing job myself,
Yep.
because I don't think that traditional publishing would be much of an option for me.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to why most of us authors now do the
Yeah,
self-publishing is for one, control, right? Because it's your vision, your story, and you don't have to change anything or remove anything that you don't want to technically. And the other thing goes to, again, it's your voice, right? It's your voice you're putting out there, and there is an audience for that voice. Like you said, there will be people out there that appreciate that, didn't know they wanted that, and said, "Wait a minute, I
right.
absolutely love this." Every author's voice will have an audience. It's just trying to have that audience find you and you find the audience, right? That's kind of the difficult part of for authors and books in general.
Yeah, it
But
is.
yeah, but it's generally, if you want your creativity and your voice, you almost have to go the self-publishing route because one of the things for the lot of the people that try to do it traditionally, one of the difficult things is that one person that is making the decision, whether it's an agent, publisher, whatever, you know if they don't like the style or don't understand your voice, they're going to decline it, right? And that doesn't mean your story's not amazing and what you wrote's not amazing. It's just that they don't understand it.
Yeah,
And sometimes that's hard. That's hard to pinpoint. You know, that decline is not really against your ability or what you produced. It's just it wasn't the right person. It wasn't the right person for what you're trying to get out there. And when you self-publish, you avoid that. Your voice is your voice and you're putting it out there. And either way, you're still going to struggle to try to find the audience to find you, but at
yeah,
least it's your original vision. You didn't have to change anything in the process to get it there.
yeah. And if you traditionally publish, you are still on the hook for promoting it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that doesn't change.
That's what I'm saying. You still have to find the audience. You just
Right.
maybe change your voice a little bit on the way. But yeah, it's probably the better way to go if you really have a specific idea or something you want to get out there, because you can get it out there much quicker. I mean, it could take years for you to find the agent, the publishing house, the person that's going to understand what you're doing. And if you're doing something completely different, maybe you never do. That's part of the issue, right? So self-publishing at least gets your story out there and gives it a chance to find that audience.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So let's talk about the comic book festival that you said you did in Houston. Why don't you give us a little bit of background about how that started? Did that start because of the store, or kind of give us, what that whole thing was?
Yeah, sure. So I had a comic book store, and I had it for a total of 16 years. I sold it in 2010. I got married, and a comic book store is not a very profitable endeavor. I mean, for like 1%, like there's a 1% of the people who make a fortune on it, and everybody else, gets by. And so my wife said to me, "You should maybe think about having a backup plan." And I'm like, "Okay, I have to think about that." And I've got an English degree. There's not a lot of very lucrative backup plans there. So the one thing is, as a store owner, I'd always struggled with trying to get rid of my excess inventory because it's not returnable in that field. And typically, the way you do that is you sell it off at comic book conventions. The guys who were in my area at the time, this was in the 90s, uh, they weren't really good. Like, I mean, they could put together a convention, a small one, but they would do them like 3 times a year. And every time they did one, it was smaller than the one before. And I kept telling them, you can't do it that way. You should do blah, 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 blah. And they're all like, no, we want to do this. Nah, nah, nah. Finally, I'm like, they're not, they're missing the fact that this is a different market and you can't do it the way. Houston's a crazy place, right? It's not New York, it's not Boston, it's not LA. And you have to do things a particular way here. And so I thought, well, they can't, none of them are going to succeed at this. So maybe I should do it. So I actually spent 2 years researching conventions. And by researching, I built financial models. There's a lot of public information. You can find out how much booth spaces cost. I'd get the map of the sales of the vendor's floor, and I'd add up how many of each type of booth there were, and I'd look at their public ticket sales numbers when they used to give that out.
Yeah.
And I'd look at the ticket prices, and I'd make estimates, and so I built whole financial models. And I spent 2 years doing this, making a plan. And but the thing is, when I figured it all out, I didn't have the money for it, because it takes a significant amount of money. And I had a comic book store, and I wasn't making a whole lot anyway. So I was sitting on this business plan. And at one point I thought, well, if I'm ever going to do this, what I need to do is just start doing events again, because I used to do some things to promote my store. Start doing events again and get into the habit of it, So I was invited to do these little setups at a movie theater. Comic stores often get invited out to this. I don't know why they want us out, but I've been to many of them. And so I was invited out to this movie theater. And so I'm like, I'm going to go out there. I want it to at least be interesting. So I found like a dozen local comic creators, invited them all out. And this was the year that Batman: The Dark Knight came out, right? So it was, I think it was like July 18th or something like that. It was the weekend. So it was like a 6-hour signing event. And everybody got to watch Batman. That was cool, and the theater owner, he had a spotlight, so he did a bat signal. It's kind of awesome. And I was promoting it, and so I was talking to this reporter, and he said, well, what do you call this event? And I'm like, this is just a little signing. I'm like, it's called Comic Palooza, right? And so we did it, this little signing event for 6 hours. And I wasn't planning for it to be the convention that I had made the business plan for. But then, a few months later, I found out that the mall that was across the street from my store was looking for events to do in the store, while, to drive people there. It was it was a mall that always struggled to find customers, right?
Yeah.
So I went in and I said, well, instead of me doing like a regular event there, how about I do this Comic Palooza? It will make it a bigger thing. And so it went from the 6-hour signing to a 2-day festival, right? And by this time I'm thinking, now I'm on track to do the convention that I'd planned to do. And so it went from 6 guys to 49 tables, which is, a nice scale up.
Yeah.
And I had, contacted organizations in the community that I thought would be really good to be partners with, and who ultimately would serve their interests to work with me. And before I held that Comic Palooza, I got a call from the Greater Houston Convention and Visitors Bureau. So it turned out they'd held on to that email. And one of the vice presidents there, he had been working in New York, and New York Comic Con had happened.
Yeah.
And he'd been out to it at the Javits Center. And then he'd moved back to Houston because he's from Houston, but he'd spent 20 years out there. He moved back to Houston, and he said, we need to get a pop culture con. And the film bureau guy that I sent this email to the year before said, oh, I know someone. And so I get this call before I do this little tiny show in the mall. I get this this call from one of the vice presidents of the Greater Houston Convention and Visitors Bureau saying, "Hey, we'd like to help you get into the George R. Brown." And I'm like, "What?" So I had this little tiny event, and I generated about $450 in profit, right? Because it's a free event, right?
Yeah.
And so I go from a budget of like $1,500 total, 1 year, to $150,000 the next year. And this was remarkable. I mean, I couldn't have done it if I had not planned, right? But what was remarkable about it is that I couldn't have done it without the convention bureau, because Houston at the time didn't understand fan conventions. It was all B2B stuff.
Yeah.
So I had a very hard time having a conversation with any of the venues, because they were all trying to, treat it like a doctor's conference or an oil and gas conference, and they don't work the same. And so they were able to help push that through and make it happen. And that was very crucial. But usually when I tell this story, they don't get it in this much depth, right? And it sounds like a rags to riches. Oh, I did it at this, movie theater, and then 60s. Because by 2015, we had 35,000 people coming, and it was 1.1 million square feet of exhibit and event space. We had over 2,000 hours of programming over a 4-day weekend, and because, my interest is in writing, we had a literary conference as part of it, as one of the tracks. So this was a literary conference with 80 to 120 authors and 60 to 80 hours of programming. I mean, it's big.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff. And so, people always, you hear it and it's like, just a rags to riches, right place, right time. There were a lot of things that happened, but the very base of it was research, and then, so the way I grew Comic Palooza was through publicity, right? The way I promoted was very different from everyone else. It was all a publicity thing. And I learned a lot about growing fandoms. And so one of the things that I want to apply from all of that to opening a publishing house is that I want to treat a book as a potential fandom, not as just a book with a certain readership. And so that means I want to recruit toy makers and game makers and various other people who might be interested in collaborating, not like Hasbro,
Yeah.
or Wizards of the Coast, but there are lots of smaller ones that can benefit from it and grow fandoms that way. And I think that is a novel approach to this industry. And we'll just, see how that works. But part of it, since I sold Comic Palooza in 2018, I am thinking about doing another literary event in a couple of years. Actually, I'm planning for 2025. That's my tentative thing right now, where it is more of a bookish thing.
Yeah.
It's like a sci-fi genre book convention with interests and activities that you would recognize at a place like Comic Palooza or some other Comic-Con, but where it's mainly focused on authors and books, smaller, but interesting. And that's another thing that I'd like to do in order to promote that book and other ones that I publish. At the same time I came out with my book, I published another author also. So I'm already working on that. So those are some of the different things that I'm looking at.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, about the publishing side of it. What made you decide that? Was it something that just kind of happened, or how did that come about?
It was pretty simple, really. So, like, I already know that whether you're traditionally published or self-published, you've got to do promotion yourself, right? I mean, I've known that since the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was doing Comic Palooza, the promotion was huge. I mean, I managed international promotions, and it was consuming. Like it swallows you when you're
Yeah.
doing a lot of it. And so and it was, when you're doing it that way, it's innovative. You have to come up with new things that people haven't done, right? And it's so much work. I'm like, Jesus, if I'm going to do that, I don't want to do it for one book. I want to do it for, a bunch of them, because it's about, you create these things that will drive interest in it periodically, event-oriented production. But you also have to develop a system. If you develop a system works better when it works over time with many different things instead of just one thing, right? So I'm like, there's no reason for me to just publish my book. I know a lot of authors in Houston because I ran Comic Palooza and we had the literary track. So I know a lot of people. And if I can build this, I think there are a lot of underpublished people who could benefit from it. So I published my book. I published another book just in the past couple of weeks. And now I'm trying to build like a system, right? And if I can build that, I can add other authors to it and make it be a, like an engine, a promotional engine. That's the goal. That's the goal.
Sounds great.
And so there's a thing I got to tell for the book launch. I want to do something kind of crazy, right? And I have this convention background, so I thought I was thinking at one point it'd be kind of funny to write a short story about sending my characters to a sci-fi convention in my sci-fi world. And I thought about that. I'm like, oh, no, I got to do that now, right? I got to do that. So, and then I thought, this could be more interesting. So I started inviting other authors to participate. And so I got a bunch of different authors, and I wasn't restricting them by genre or by medium, right? So I've got a cartoonist who draws cute ants, and I've got a contemporary romance writer, and the person whose book I'm publishing, that's a historical mystery, and there's fantasy. And I came up with a device to bring them all here, right, into this convention. And it is an imaginary convention that takes place in that time. And we did it as a series of posts on social media. So if you're following it, you could read these posts, and each day there would be different posts throughout the course of this convention. And so we finished that. That was my book launch. And I'm almost done. We've collected it. I've just got a few changes to make on the cover and the links. And I'm going to release that as a free anthology. And so it was called RenthCon 2323. And I got Jim Butcher to do a story for it. So, that's a very unusual kind of promotion.
Yep.
Right.
Sounds great. I love the idea.
So that will actually, so I don't know what your air date on this is, but about a week from now, let's say around the 14th or 15th, I expect it'll be up on Amazon and Kobo and all of those as a free download. And
this will probably air in sometime early November. So we'll definitely be able to add the links and everything down below for that.
Oh yeah, I'll send it to you next week.
Okay.
When you get it. But yeah, so I do a lot of weird stuff. So
that sounds great. So are you looking to start doing publishing others full time, or it's just going to be as you go and as you build the system?
Well, I've got these two books. I'm actually going to. I'm planning to go to a horror convention in October, and I'm going to do a call for submissions for horror books at the horror convention. Right. I'm not going to sell a lot of sci-fi and historical mystery there, right?
Yeah.
But that's kind of a fun thing to do, and it's interactive and it builds awareness. And there's a lot of really good horror writers in Houston. And so I'm going to look at building them as I acquire authors. That will also help build the publicity engine that I'm planning to, or that I'm trying to create.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to what you're going to have coming up. This sounds very interesting. The whole thing you have planned out.
Well, thank you.
Um, Future in general, do you have other goals besides the publishing side, besides the stuff that you have coming out? Any other plans for things to work on?
Well, I mean, I know the sequel. Like I figure Rinth is going to be a trilogy. And they're big, right? They're huge. This is not something where I'm going to come out with one each year.
Yeah.
But my working title for the sequel to Explorers of Rinth is Council of Rinth. Maybe I'll change it, but that's my working title. And but Rinth is a really, really intricate world, right? And like I'm not going to be able to come out with something every year, but like one of the things I'd like to do is find writers that I like and have them write short stories in it and come out with anthologies in the universe, and find other writers who'd like to write in it and in specific locations in it, because it's so diverse. It can handle a lot of different kinds of stories. I'd like to grow it out, not just as like my own personal world, but like a whole, expansive universe.
Yeah.
That's one of my goals. So
That sounds great. I just want to remind the viewers that I will leave all the links for John below. The links for his books, the links for his website, or anything else he wants to put down there so you can find him. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and leave a comment for either John or myself. If you have any questions, have anything you want to know more about, we'd love to hear from you. Again, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification so you don't miss all the amazing authors coming up. Again, I want to just thank you for coming on, John. This has been great. I absolutely loved the conversation. Loved all the stories about what you're working on and how everything came together. And just
thank you.
appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have you on again in the future when you have some of the other stuff out, and when you get some more of the other authors and stuff published. I'd love to bring you back on and we could discuss those as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you again, John, and thank you, viewers, for watching at home. Goodbye.